Hello and welcome to the Heads and Volleys podcast with me, Lee Dunn. Joining me today, I have a very special episode and it includes a brand new friend of mine. His name is Paddy King. He is the director of coaching for CUSA soccer in Ohio. He has an incredible background and a storied travel past of the way the game has taken him across the country in the US. He originates from the UK and is very honest about his upbringing in the game, and something that is quite a hot topic for a lot of coaches is the comparison of people that have played the game at a high level and those that have not, and that's a really interesting discussion that we end up getting into. He traveled through working from the Red Bulls into Arizona, and we talk a lot about what his pathway has taught him and how self-reflection is such a key tool for everybody, and how you can only continue to develop if you really use that as a way of your own assessment, especially if you're in a lot of situations where you may be the only coach on the field and you don't necessarily have a director of coaching or a fellow peer that can actually be out there with you and give you feedback. Before I get into that, a huge thank you to Tactical Pad for their continued support. Their software is truly fantastic, and we talk here a lot about presenting ideas to coaches and to clubs and creating cultures of players. And Tactical Pad's tool is a real valuable tool to show your players and to show other coaches exactly what you mean. If you're trying to develop a certain type of play or a certain game model, as Patrick discusses in this podcast, then this is a really brilliant tool to take into any environment and to simply show. Most people learn by seeing, and that's a real cool way to show them exactly what you mean and engage with them in a way that often we don't by just simply forcing things on people or telling them what we think we should be doing or what we think we need to be seeing. So again, thank you to Tactical Pad. And away we go with this interview with Paddy King from CUSA Soccer in Ohio.
All right, Paddy, thanks for your time, mate. Everybody, I'm talking right here with Paddy King. Now, you're out in Ohio, beautiful Ohio, and then you've had quite a background too of travel across the US and coming from the UK. You want to give us a little insight on that as well?
Yeah, sure, no problem. Yeah, it's a bit of a varied background, bit of a sort of storied past in making my way over here. So I met my beautiful wife. She's from Brooklyn. She's American. You know, long story short, fast forward a few years, we got married, and then we moved to America. So my coaching background in the UK had only ever been what you might call volunteer or hobby basis. Even there's no real, as you know, there's no real way to make a career out of coaching in the UK unless you are lucky enough to be at one of the top academies in the country, like a Premier League academy, and even then these guys will typically have second jobs as teachers or whatnot. So I was a lawyer in the UK, was coaching on the side. When I came to America, I was very fortunate and was offered a position with the New York Red Bulls, and that was full-time, paid, and allowed me to kind of hone my craft as not just a hobby anymore, but as a career. And that's probably where it started for me. Being at Red Bulls was like being at football university. It was a massive education with some really, really top quality coach educators, some of which are still there, some of which have moved on to parties new. And that's probably where my obsession with technical training or skill development, depending on which side of the coin you're on, began. After a few years, though, I realized that, you know, such a huge organization, I probably needed to branch out a little bit on my own. And my wife and I, 2 children in at this point, moved to Arizona, where I was a director of coaching there.
So New York to Arizona was quite a difference, quite a change.
Yeah, it was. My wife went to school, to college out in Arizona, ASU, I'll give them a little name check. And I went down there to do a coaching course, one of the US soccer licenses. And I stayed there for a few days due to flights or whatever it was. And I just really fell in love with the place. The weather was phenomenal. The soccer scene there was huge, all concentrated in one area. much, called the Valley, just outside of Phoenix. And when I got back, my wife and I, we talked a little bit about it, and she said, well, obviously, I like it. I went to school there. I love it. I've still got friends out there. And so we decided, just thought, well, hey, let's do it. Let's give it a go. Neither of us are afraid of traveling. Obviously, I'm now living in America. My wife was in the UK for a couple of years. We don't have any huge routes that we can't change. So we took the punt, and I ended up working in Arizona for 2 fantastic years, maybe a little bit longer than that, actually. And the opportunity to grow came up with CUSA. Now, with all respect to anyone who lives in Ohio, it's not a place, being an Englishman, I necessarily really heard of or had designs on living in. But, the opportunity came up. I came down for a visit. The place is lovely. We're in the middle of the countryside here. And the soccer scene in Ohio South and Ohio North is pretty competitive as well. So I sort of snapped their arms off at the opportunity to come and work here and be the director of coaching at the club. And so far, what am I in, about maybe 7 or 8 months in? So far, so good.
I think you've really painted the picture of what a typical soccer coach or someone who's committed to the game experiences here in the US, that they tend to be all over. So I know from my own experience of coaching courses and classes that if you're a college coach, you are ready to end up wherever you need to end up to take the next gig or to be involved in the next level. And the same thing here, if you want to be that next level of director of coaching or technical director, those roles don't often come up too much. And so it requires that commitment of travel. And for a lot of people, I know that they move all over. And your prime example, to have gone from New York to Arizona and then up into Ohio, that's some serious miles with some good support underneath.
It is, yeah, and obviously couldn't done any of that without my wife being 100% behind me. And I don't ask people to feel too sorry for me, though, because this job, this line of work allows me to do a few things. It allows me to stay at home during the day and raise my children, not have to outsource them to childcare and that kind of stuff. It allows my wife to go out and focus on her career. It allows me to work from home, and then the sacrifices are that, all the evenings, obviously, as every evening you're out in the cold and the wet, and the weekends you could be hundreds of miles from home, and maybe you don't see your wife and family as much in the weekends and on the evenings as you would hope to, or if you had a regular office job. But that's the trade-off, right? You get paid to do something that you really enjoy and hopefully are good at, and you get to raise your family and kind of keep that whole unit together, and that's the trade-off. I think it's a wonderful trade-off. So I really do. I don't mean to sound cliche, but I do consider myself pretty lucky.
I want to kind of pick on some of the areas you worked in. So kind of move through what the experience was like with the Red Bulls a little more, and kind of what you learned along the way. And I think that as many coaches that will listen to this, or even volunteers that coach the same team, their kind of experience of moving or being involved with other people. So it's never a success, I don't think, or it's never a waste of time if you are going to take something away from an experience, whether that's a positive or a negative. That you've worked with some incredible coaches, and I'm sure you could probably name a couple of people that you would say should never ever be paid a cent to be working in youth soccer, but you learn something from all of those people, right? And I have a similar list too. So let's start with the Red Bulls and kind of some of the key things that you picked up from there that you took into Arizona and now bringing into CUSA too.
Yeah, no worries at all. So Red Bulls, just for anyone that doesn't know, obviously they're the MLS club, but I think I'm right in saying that they're also the biggest provider of youth soccer coaches outside of some of the sort of charitable-based or volunteer-based organizations. So in the tri-state area, they have it locked up. If you are a club in that region, there's a very high chance that if you want to take your club to the next level and step away from volunteer coaches, parent coaches, you would have engaged someone from Red Bulls to come into your club, and that could be across any level. Like, you could bring them in as director, you might just bring them in as a regular coach for 2 teams, or even a trainer. There's every level of job you can imagine in Red Bulls they offer. They're brilliant to their staff, in my opinion. I was really fortunate that due to where I lived, so I lived out in a place called Staten Island, that it was not too far from a place in Newark called Ironbound, which if anyone is really, really, really into soccer in that area, they'll know about. There's a high school there that produces a disproportionate amount of top-level players. And the club Ironbound itself is in Newark, was just an exceptional. I actually don't think I've seen such an organic group of talent in one place that wasn't, like an academy or a top-notch paid-for club or something like that, supplemental training or whatever it was. These guys were just local kids. Predominantly, they were of Hispanic descent. I want to say like places like Paraguay, Ecuador, and then all the rest of the sort of beautiful countries that you've got in South America. There may even been some Spanish in there as well, but typically South American descent. So these guys lived and breathed, and it really wasn't a cliche. They lived and breathed football, and that showed because when I went to coach them, I could go straight in and we could work on sort of what you might call technical, tactical stuff. I wasn't being forced to go in and teach them step overs or how to dribble or how to control a ball under pressure. They knew this because probably 10 hours a day they were out on the street kicking the ball around with their friends. And I think their neighborhood was very atypical of, I want to say 99% of any other place I've been in the States. It was a neighborhood in the realest sense. There'd be someone looking out of a window watching the 10 kids play, kids. So these guys could safely play soccer or football in the middle of the street. And it was just a real football community, really was. And then to top it off, Red Bull's stadium was, 500 meters over the river. And it was just a breeding ground for talent. And I think a lot of these kids, Red Bulls forged a relationship with Ironbound, and a lot of these kids were then sort of filtered off into the academy, and I believe still doing very well. So that was my main experience at Red Bull in terms of my coaching assignments. I was lucky enough to shadow and observe and work with all the higher level stuff, but the stuff I was paid to do was really the Ironbound teams. Red Bull.
That sounds like when any conversation you have with, as you said, kind of 99% of other coaches around, you say kids just don't play like they used to. Well, it sounds like in Ironbound, that's what they're clearly still doing.
It was unbelievable, mate. I don't think they're. I obviously have not been all over the States, but I've been around a decent bit through football, actually, but I've just never seen anything like it.
So then into Arizona, I imagine that's quite a difference from the Red Bull experience.
It was in Arizona. I was director of coaching and responsible for two teams exclusively, so they were my teams. Whereas in Ironbound, I might have been referred to, I think maybe slightly somewhat of an American term, but as a trainer. In Arizona, it was more what you would probably call traditional coaching. You could work on long-term planning with these guys. You could see where they were and where you wanted them to be at the end of the season, end of the year, end of the next year. And that was completely different. Very good level of play, again. Decent soccer community. A little bit cutthroat in Arizona because I think I mentioned earlier that all the clubs are concentrated in one area and there's constant struggles. And it was like the actual Wild West in terms of, it was just, there was constant dramas based around those kind of things, the threat of players leaving or teams leaving or teams coming over to your clubs or coaches leaving or coaches coming over was just a daily occurrence, and it was a little bit tiresome, to be honest. But I think it was all as a result of these clubs being in such close proximity and all fighting for the same player pool. So maybe that had something to do with it. But very nice experience, year-round training, which was not something that I was used to. In Arizona, year-round outdoors, which was just fantastic. I mean, you could really work on your team. You could periodize. you're training properly, you could long-term plan, or at least medium-term planning, and you pretty much guaranteed to crack through your session plans and your curriculum without losing anything to rain or snow. Or I think, ironically or conversely, we lost some sessions to heat. Once it went up past 110, it was sometimes deemed too dangerous, depending on the time of the day you were training. But it was fantastic. I think if more clubs had access to year-round training, I think the level of play in the States would just go through the roof. I really do.
As an Englishman, having practice cancelled because it's too hot sounds like a crazy dream. It's never too hot. It's never too hot. We like the heat. But I agree with you too in that the weather can be a huge factor in killing off practices. And I don't know, like a traditional amount of practice time for most teams is two times a week, sometimes 3. Teams are starting to get to 4 now, but that's an extreme in a lot of places where the standard is 2 or 3 times a week. And I agree with you. The growth of the game, unless you're in a community like Ironbound where you've got players playing all the time, it's very difficult to see significant improvement across the level of play.
Well, I think you'd love to chat to my friend Chad. He would link that comment that you made directly back to promotion and relegation. I think that's a conversation for another day, because you could really get down the rabbit hole there. But I completely agree. I think it's almost impossible. I actually think, I know the US men's national team does get a lot of stick. I almost think it's testament to something that has gone on that they're even where they are, because, like you say, 2 or 3 times a week, losing half the year to cold and snow. It's clearly a new culture to the US, with hardly any practice time in huge parts of the country. How do they even get as good as they currently are? They have qualified for World Cups recently, and they still do all right. And obviously, if you look at the women's side of the game, they smash it. They're getting caught a little bit now by other nations, but they've dominated in recent times. So I think it's a real testament to the US and that kind of spirit of overcoming and succeeding. But now imagine if they could train all the time, anywhere, street corners, parks, school. Imagine if school focused on football or soccer. You would have to say that at some point, assuming the culture changes, and that's probably going to be a slow burner, but you would have to say at some point they are going to be a powerhouse, right? If they start to get things right.
I would agree with you. I always said that I thought the US would win a World Cup before England did. When I left England, and it's only recently begun to turn, and we've begun to, I feel like, get to grips with what we really have to offer as a nation, and kind of get a lot of teams and a lot of clubs and a lot of communities on the same page of driving towards one common goal. And I think we can get that right here in the US. And kind of like you said about the situation in Arizona is probably very similar in a lot of cities. And I work here in San Francisco and in the Bay Area, and the story's the same. It's lots of fighting for players or for teams, and it seems to be an environment in which a lot of parents and a lot of players have the power. So they are the ones who offer that threat again. We will leave this club, we will go to another club, we will move on. And collectively, I'd love to see everybody get together and say, okay, you make your decision, and I won't be jumping on the phone with them as soon as they tell you they're leaving, so I can snap them up, because next year they'll do the same to me again. And so there's lots of issues underpinning, I think, what is hurting the success. And I also think that as players get older, they begin to strive for college. And for many, it seems to be a vehicle to be able to go to college. I think it's a very expensive experience for a lot of individuals if they can't get in on some level of scholarship. But then also, that seems to be really the first place where players experience what you call, I guess, some kind of professional environment. That it takes them until they're 17, 18, 19 years old to be in an environment where they're training every day. And I just think that is a large part of the reason why the players, if you're waiting until that old to begin training like a professional, I think it's too late, and I think that players should be doing that sooner.
I think there's a lot of truth in there. I must say, I can't profess to know the answer, because if I did, I would tell people about it. But you would think, just commonsensically, you would think what you just said is absolutely right. You would say that this constant club hopping and shopping around and coaches and clubs being held over a barrel, you would say that is also part of the problem. I would say not fully understanding the promotion and relegation system as it applies to almost every other country in the world, in every sport in the world, is an issue, because sometimes there's nothing to fight for, so you don't have to fight, right? Whereas other places in the world, well, there is stuff to fight for, because you're going to be in a lower league next year if you don't buck your ideas up. I do think soccer is on the rise. Now, will the culture become like that we have in the UK or Spain or Italy or France or Germany? Not necessarily, right? It's a different country and different people, and it's pay to play and all the issues that come along with pay to play. But, I mean, you can't wave a magic wand and change everything overnight. So hopefully over time, there's a lot of new and green coaches that have never played football before that are coaching and educating. Well, I think these guys are starting to age out a little bit, and now you've got younger kids coming through, people much younger than me still, who have been through what you just said. They've been through the college experience. They've had coaching that is as close to professional coaching as you can probably get in the US, and probably a lot better than you would get in a lot of places in the UK and Spain and France and all that, because this is their full-time job, and they take it very seriously. So my hope is that when these guys come through, and we've got a couple of really good young coaches at our club, when they've got another 10 years under their belt and they've picked up all the experience from coaching, they marry that with their playing career, and now the environment's slowly starting to change, maybe, right, maybe, just maybe, there's a good shot that the US will start to really take off, and I really do hope so.
What was your biggest takeaway from your Red Bulls experience? What was something that you took with you to Arizona, something that you saw, or something you want to implement as a DOC down there, something that really stuck with you?
So without a shadow of a doubt, it would have been technical training. I lived to breathe that for sort of my 3 years at Red Bulls, and I was like a sponge. I kind of absorbed everything I was taught there and disregarded stuff that I didn't agree with. Kept the stuff I did agree with. I did research in the time that I was at Red Bulls. I also did a master's degree in coaching, and I think I wrote, I can't remember if it's a thesis now, it's just a very long paper on technical development or skill development, and how you acquire it and how you coach it. And for me, it was brilliant. Red Bulls really questioned everything. They didn't just trot out these, time-tested sessions. They had people all day, every day, who would write and generate, try and test, and either give it a thumbs up or a thumbs down, and then share these sessions on technical development. Red Bulls believed, I don't want to put words in their mouth, but really steering away from overt tactics, so chalkboard type tactics, I would say, until you were kind of around 14 plus. They would teach tactics, i.e. decision making, through their activities, but it wouldn't necessarily be a heavy predominance of this. It would be more about, I would say 80% of what they did at Red Bulls was about skill development. And one thing I learned from them was that and they had this kind of cautionary tale about a kid who was once taught that New York Red Bulls has a pre-academy called the RDS, Regional Development School. It's very talented players. And there's a player in this that was shown how to do something like a step over against a cone with no moving parts, no decision making, no pressure, no time constraints. And he did it thousands and thousands of times, and he nailed it, got it down perfectly. And there were times where in games, this young player would have no pressure on him. He'd be open, he'd be completely open in the field with the ball in a game, and would just, for some reason, do a random scissors or a random step over or whatever it was, without any thought as to why he'd done it, without any thought of the consequences, that he just slowed himself down on a dribble, might lose the ball. It's just, hey, I've practiced this, I'm going to use it in the game. And I think that happened way before I joined. I think that might have been a trigger point for Red Bulls to move away from what is commonly called isolated technical development and move more towards skill development. Now, without getting into the semantics or sounding like a bore on the subject, the two are very different. Technical development is unopposed, isolated repetitions of a movement. May it be a step over, a Ronaldo chop, an inside outside, whatever you want to call it. Skill development is taking something that doesn't necessarily have to look like a skill or a move. It could just be a freestyle, free-flowing thing, but training players how to perform actions against pressure, time constraints, space constraints. Maybe it's a real defender, maybe it's fully opposed, maybe it's semi-opposed. And the real difference between the two is that one looks absolutely beautiful and pretty and is very rehearsed, but has zero decision-making. The other one doesn't necessarily have to look like a move. It could just be a shoulder drop. It could be a turn of pace, but it's real time. It's born out of hundreds and hundreds and hundreds, thousands of repetitions against real defenders in real spaces, you know, with actual lines where if the ball goes out, you've lost the ball. Decisions, so one defender, two defenders, you know, one attacker, two attackers, one defender, you know, that kind of stuff. And the research behind that will show you that one might lead to the other, but like you said earlier, if you've only got 2 sessions a week, can you really afford to spend half an hour of one session doing unopposed, you know, TikToks or step overs or pick another move? If you only have a limited amount of time and you work on the basic premise that without technique there are no tactics, right? If your kids can't handle a ball, they certainly can't play out the back. If your kids can't go 1v1, well, they certainly can't penetrate and score. So if you work on that premise that inverted commas technique, or what I've just said is skill, is important, well, then you have to prioritize or put into a hierarchy those two things, technical development versus skill development. Like I say, one might lead to the other, but if you only have half an hour a week, for me, the research, my anecdotal experience, it's skill development all day, every day. And the way to do that or the importance of that is something that I always take away from Red Bulls. These guys were ingenious at designing sessions that provoked or elicited certain movements, certain angles of pressure, and there was no right or wrong way to do it, but they might say, you know, you might have a recovering defender. You guys have both got to get to this little pug goal, and, you know, they might show you beforehand a couple of times, hey, this is the Ronaldo chop, right? This will allow your defender to blow by you. You cut in behind on the diagonal, then you go to the other goal. You don't have to do this, but if you do this, maybe this is 3 points and another solution is 1 point. So they're trying to put the idea in your mind, but giving you a realistic setting where you have to make a decision as a player. How do I go from A to B whilst trying to beat C? And that stayed with me. So I've never wasted a second since then on isolated technique. I'm not in an environment where I work with kids 8 times a week or 8 hours a week. If I were, maybe I would incorporate that as a nice little warm-up, a nice little lead-in, polish off the moves. But I'm not. I'm in the real world that most coaches are in, which is 2 to 3 sessions a week, and I have to prioritize what I teach and how I teach it. So for me, the real takeaway from Red Bulls is skill development must be opposed, must be realistic, must be under some kind of pressure, and absolutely must provoke some kind of decision-making, inverted commas, tactical decisions.
How do you feel, and I guess let me preface this with kind of my experience of running coach education classes and working with the recreational low-level competitive coaches, is they may not feel prepared or feel like they know enough to be able to create these situations for your players like that, like a 1v1, 2v1, 2v2, where it's dynamic and it's fast and it's challenging. And so it's often easier to isolate players into individual skills. Everybody has their own little area, almost like that kind of early Curva type stuff where it's just lots and lots and lots and lots of touches where players do it over and over again without the realistic competition. So do you use a lot of the same practices and kind of setups, and then you just tweak it as you go, or do you introduce something new all the time? How do you go about making this possible for your players? Because I've found that often players take a little bit of time to learn what they're being tasked with before they can even begin to execute it properly.
That last point is exceptionally valid in my opinion. And that is why I would say that there's a hierarchy of needs. For me, working in a club environment, which is above recreational, inverted commas above, and below academy or development academy or professional, I have this kind of window of sessions, 3 sessions a week. I have certain expectations, or the parents have certain expectations of levels of play. Parents have certain expectations of what player development is, and they've got a certain amount of tolerance to what it is, and then also what it isn't. So the unopposed stuff just wouldn't fly. If I had an extra session a week, like a 4th separate session, maybe. When you go and look at the recreational stuff, I think it's very, very, very difficult. You've got all these variables, and you've got players that may have never, ever, ever, ever played in their life. So it might be beneficial to show them some unopposed stuff. And this is my own thoughts. There's not a ton of, I don't have any kind of empirical evidence for this, but my only comment there would be, if this 5-year-old player has never played before and you only train them once a week and they don't know what dribbling is, let alone how to do it, would you bother spending time on rehearsing, for example, a step over? And I see this quite often in recreational programs around here and in places I've been, because what they're trying to do is they're taking stuff that they've seen maybe from a U8 academy team, or an isolated skills session, or an extra, let's pay $5 and bring your player along, and we're going to work on nothing but skills today or technique today, and they apply it. And I think they apply it because, one, it's very easy to mimic, right? You can stop all the players running around, you can isolate them, you can walk around and correct them. They've got to focus on the ball, one player, and you can manage a group of 20 kids very easily. You just say, right, everyone on a cone, we're going to do this for the next 10 minutes. Do I think it's useless? No, absolutely not. Do I think it's the most beneficial thing that player could be doing? No. Rec coaches have a very difficult job, and I think when you've got, 10 kids that may or may not be interested or may have differing levels of interest, it's very easy and manageable to break down a session and kind of work on the sort of the old Dutch model, or I think you referred to the kind of early curve stuff, right, where you're on a station and you're doing a bunch of moves. It looks good, doesn't it? Because a kid can go from not being able to do a step over in 5 minutes to be able to do a step over. So the parents looking at it go, well, that was $50 a season well spent. Look, they've already learned this. The coach was happy with himself. The kid has a sense of achievement. So on a level other than skill development, you might say, hey, that's 4 checks in the box there, and I couldn't disagree. But in terms of what that player can now do in a 3v3 game situation, or nothing, right? I don't think they've brought anything to their game. So have they learned, have developed? I don't know. I would say no, or I would say more no than yes. That's not a cop-out answer.
So you go into Arizona, you go into the DOC as well as kind of leading the team. So then you're now influencing these coaches that are working with teams around you. Was this a new idea for them? Was this something that kind of reinvented the wheel for them? Was there any pushback on kind of implementing this idea of skill versus technical training?
So I would say the pushback was huge, but it was more pushback at being told that, hey, there's now a curriculum, hey, there's now session plans, hey, there's now a game model. Half the coaches are like, well, what's a game model, right? Because it's a relatively new thing. No, it's not. It's a relatively newly understood thing. Some of the coaches in Arizona were kind of turning up to pick up their paycheck. They were older guys who, they'd coached a bit of high school and thought they knew it all, and really they were kind of archaic in their approach. They weren't willing to learn. Maybe would yes you to your face, but then you would hear on the grapevine, that they were massively unhappy and what's all this stuff and why am I being asked to do more work, and to be honest, we cycled those coaches out. They were moved on or left to go to other clubs, and what we were left with was a bunch of very committed, very dedicated coaches who were the first people to put their hands up and say, I don't understand all of this, but I'm willing to learn and willing to try. So it was a learning curve for me in Arizona on how to implement this without getting pushback, how to sort of shove it down people's throats without appearing to shove it down their throats, and how to implement it without them thinking that I'm basically saying, read between the lines, you don't know what you're doing, so I'm going to do it for you. And it wasn't any of that, but it may have appeared like that to some people, and maybe that was a good thing because the pushback I got allowed me to change my ways of doing certain things, allowed me to maybe be a bit more of a people person, or a bit more sensitive to people's sensitivities when you're coming in as a new guy and saying, yeah, everything you've done for the last X amount of years, we're changing that now. So it really did need to be done, and I must say that I'll give her a name check. The new director, Lindsay Johnson, although she may have gone in a slightly different direction, she certainly picked that up and runs it like that to this day. There is a defined way of doing things. That club has an identity now, and they'll become known for it.
I just finished the B license recently, and Lindsay was in my class too. Lindsay's fantastic, so we'll give her a real big shout out for that one.
Good. So the pushback wasn't necessarily about the technical stuff. It was more in general, hey, we don't want to be told what to do by you and, some flash Englishman coming in, right? It's, I completely understand and empathize their reactions and had to work with it. And I'm delighted to say that over the course of a couple of years, things turned around and the club started playing a particular way, and some coaches bought into it more than others, and those coaches had more success. In my opinion, over the limited amount of time. So yeah, no, it's good.
When you can create that environment for your coaches to feel safe and to be engaged with you, then you just get this flourishing environment where your players are going to have a good time because they know what's being asked of them, and the coach is enjoying it because they have a solid framework from which to work in, and it's not just the Wild West where today I want to work on corners, or one of my favorites was watching a coach teach his girls how to practice slide tackling. So then you move off to CUSA. Now you've been there 8 months. What have you taken from Arizona and probably from Red Bulls too? Is it still along that theme of the skills and technical training, or have you kind of changed ways a little bit? Is there anything that's different that you've brought in here now?
So one of the problems with being me, right, my wife will tell you there's a bunch of problems with being me. One of the problems with being me that I've identified is I'm never satisfied with where I'm at as a coach or a coach educator. And I think a lot of that probably comes from having a bit of a subconscious chip on my shoulder that I never played at a good level. Therefore, I never received coaching at a good level. So I am, much like my Spanish, self-taught. So when you talk about terms of bringing things from place to place, although I bring an overarching idea, philosophy, and that is heavily predicated on two things: technical or skill and technique excellence and positional play. They're constantly changing as to how I might elicit those or choose to coach them or choose to educate my coaches on those topics. So although they're steadfast components, them themselves are constantly being edited and rewritten and rethought by myself. And to the point where I think I had our game model printed for our coaches at CUSA. We had a coach education meeting on March 4th where I introduced the idea, and I had them printed March 3rd. On March 5th, I was then rewriting it for next time. I was still tweaking this, so I'm not sure about that. That didn't go as well as I thought. That could have been better.
I love the idea that you're not a closed book, and I think the best and most successful coaches never are, and that I think it's healthy to question yourself, but not super healthy to think that I'm questioning myself because I'm completely out of my own depth. And I don't think that any of us truly are out of our depth, in that we have this phenomenal experience. Look at the places that you yourself have worked, Paddy, and the places that you've come from. Now, it's perfectly healthy to question and say, is this the best way for perhaps for this player or for this environment or for this team? And I think any time that you can finish a practice, and I just released an episode about redefining your own success, and within that is to actually review and reflect on everything you do. And I don't think, like, if you walk into a door, there's no way that you don't say, did I just walk into the door? Why did I do that? What went wrong there? And I think that your practices should be identical. Did that work? Did that work because the players understood it? Was it too easy? Was it too hard? My Red Bull players can do it. Why can't these players do it? Are they a different age? And just really begin to identify what it is that you are experiencing in that moment. And I think you talk about these coaches that have 40 years experience, 30 years experience. I coached high school and we won regionals. Those are the general types of coaches that we fear because they don't want to change. They don't want to be the ones that will open up to these new ideas and will still probably practice by dribbling around cones because that's the way they were taught. And I think one of my biggest passions of coach education is to really help people see that the game is forever evolving, or there are constantly new ways to challenge and engage with your players. And I think if that's all we take from one experience to another, I think that we're on that route of creating and developing these individual players that can have success in any environment.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I mean, when you talk about the self-learning or self-reflection, I typically have my sessions out with me, even though I wrote them and I know them inside out. I have them out with me and constantly scribbling on them, things that just didn't work. And I don't typically measure out dimensions on my sessions because I find that can be so varied depending on age, ability, gender, that's irrelevant really. But coaching points or tweaks to the session itself, or constant notes and sort of what you might call self-reflection, because I'm now going to, the following year, give this to the coaches again, right? And I'm not going to just turn out the same old stuff. I'm going to get their reflections, my reflections, pull it together, think about it, rewrite it, and then they'll get probably the same session with a bunch of upgrades, let's say. I think that's vitally important, and I think that's probably vitally important in any walk of life. And, soccer coaching in the US attracts a lot of frauds. There's a lot of people that flood it with kind of COD psychology and all these trends and, all the different learning styles. They might know, they might have read the sort of the York Notes version on it, or the Crib Notes version of what Guide to Discovery is, and they pontificate about it. But self-reflection is one of those things that I constantly see come up, and I wonder how serious people are about it. Like, do they really mean that? Are you going home after your session and rewriting your session or putting your notes down on paper? And some people are, and good for them, but I think a lot of people sort of like to be seen to be doing that and probably would come out with exactly the same session next time. But if you're serious about progressing and you don't want me to hand you session plans because you know what you're doing, well, then that is something you need to do, right? You can't just rely on your college or high school playing background. That doesn't cut it anymore. Coaching in this country is now evolving, as it might not have started at the same place, but it's evolving as quickly as anywhere else on the planet because of the way information is now disseminated on via videos and internet and coaching courses, and you can do, all these great education providers out of Spain are doing stuff online now, so you can take it here. Kieran Smith doing a fantastic positional play course online. You can do it in Ohio, right? You didn't have to go to Spain to do it. So I think the rest of the world hasn't got the jump on American coaches anymore. But having said that, if you want to keep up, well, then now you probably do have to put in that extra bit of self-reflection. What did I do right? What did I do wrong? And if you don't do that and you're a little bit lazy, then you probably won't ever climb the heights or kind of pull yourself out of that second team that you're on, that kind of thing,
Yeah, absolutely. Just I encourage people so much just to, even if you're just beginning with your self-reflection and it's just a 30-second review, just become familiar with critiquing yourself, because then you're going to make so many changes, or even maybe you don't make changes because you feel confident in what you've done, but at least you've got the belief in yourself to say, this is working or this is not working, and this is how I'm going to do it. And you take any coaching license now within the US pyramid, and there's constant reflection. Why did you do it this way? Why is that? How is that? You present, you deliver on the field, and then you stand in front of a room full of your peers and explain why you did it and what went so well and what did not go so well. And if you find yourself in an environment where, if you're lucky enough to have a director who isn't coaching a team that can give you feedback, I will snap anybody's hand off that will give me feedback, because I want to know what you think. Like what, and not just, was it a good session? Were the kids having a good time? But and this is something I want to get us onto next, is the language. How am I engaging with my players? How am I interacting with them to find success or to address issues or mistakes, and not just saying, why do you give the ball away, but really exploring with that player what they can do differently. So I think self-reflection is what's going to change anybody's coaching career in the immediate. So let's go into kind of move this on and begin to wrap up by a quick, probably not so quick discussion about language. And we talked about it a little earlier too, but the language that you use with your players, kind of how you are asking them to do things, is so often misconstrued, and it can mean different things for different players, but you tend to use the same words for those players. So we talked about dismarking. That's one of your favorites right now, and I love following you on Twitter and reading the discussions about it, because it's everybody, I feel, in that environment is saying something similar but in their own way, and I think that is that transforms fully into the game for kids too, where I may say check, but a defender checking to the goalkeeper or checking to another player is completely different than a striker checking, because of the amount of ways we want them to move. So just a little bit on language and your thoughts on that.
Yeah, it's a really, really good question. I think quite hot right now as well. For all of his faults, I'm a big fan of Raymond Verheyen. When I first moved to the US, I can't remember how, but I came across his work and I bought his first book, and it talked about this kind of universal soccer language that, if we all understood what we were all talking about at all times, it makes things a lot more efficient for the coach and for the learner. And I think his approach was a little bit too dogmatic, if anything, but I took his point and the principle. Roll that forward, I now bring with me a game model when I go to a new club. I brought it to Arizona, and I brought an improved and rewritten one to CUSA, and that's something that I roll out across the club. So it's important for me that my coaches and my players, even if they don't understand, even if the players don't understand every nuance of the game model, it's very important that we are at least talking in commonalities and using common language for the majority of things. So we have lots of words and phrases that we use that I brought, and then we have a lot that the coaches here used before I got here that I'd never heard of, but everyone understood it. So why change it? I'll give you the example that's on the tip of my tongue is have one. I don't know if you've ever heard that. I'd never heard that before, right? So for kids in a shooting position, everyone will start to shout at them, have one, all right, have a shot. Okay, fair enough. So I now have incorporated that back at them. In terms of language that is key to the game model, yeah, I have very fixed language. In terms of other stuff that's more general and less important, no, I have no need to impose my language on anyone. But when you talk about things like dismarking, double movements, so dismarking, lots of different ways to dismark, but typically the way we're using it is dismarking to support a player, dismarking, drifting away subtly without trying to be caught, without drawing someone's eye line. just trying to drift in behind them to maybe go dark. Double movements, typically moving, and that might be what some people call check two, but now the double movement is moving towards the ball to sort of spark a relationship with the receiver and the passer, to then time that relationship, time that pass, to time the second part of that movement to just be onside and rupture a defensive line as that ball is played. So that word has a very key meaning, which I think is much, much more convoluted and complicated than check, right? Check two or check away. It's talking about establishing a relationship, like a temporal and a spatial relationship between the passer and the receiver. And it's this kind of non-verbal communication which establishes that relationship and basically says, as I come towards you, you better now be gearing up to play that return ball over the top or to the side or wherever it is as I turn and spin. So I'm going to bring that defender out of his spot, and then either you play that ball back to me, or maybe when I drag that defender out, another player goes into the spot he's vacated, and you're going to build a spatial and temporal relationship with that guy. And obviously that sounds very convoluted and complicated, but when you work on it enough in training in sort of 3v2 type situations, it becomes second nature. And all we have to say now is double movement, and the player, the passer and the receiver or receivers all understand what we're looking at, what we're trying to achieve, and there's a common goal as well as a common language. That another coach who is overhearing that on the opposition team or other players may or may not know what you're talking about. So there's that element to it as well. It's almost like a code within our club when other people are on the outside looking in, almost like the old rugby line-out throw-in calls, you know. But when you're on the inside, it means everything to us. It means 1,000 words. It means 1,000 repetitions of practice. It means a lot more than that check to or check away.
Yeah. So how do you begin to deliver that type of material? So you have an idea, and I'm sure probably many people listening to this will have an idea of how they want to play. And I guess before you even begin to identify what your language may be, I would suggest recording yourself during a practice or during a game. And how many words do you say? How many of the same word do you say? And begin to understand if you are using the word check or show or have one, then begin to identify how often you're saying it and why and where you're saying it, and then you begin to build an idea around that language. So then once you know that, you're probably saying it lots of times because the players aren't doing it. So therefore, we need to figure out how we're going to deliver that. How do you kind of approach that? How do you begin to deliver that to your players?
So for me, I have a natural handicap. I get tongue-tied very easily, and I'm quite an eloquent writer. I'm not the best speaker. I do generally trip over my words. So for me, it's a way, I think, of calming my brain down in the excitement of a coaching session, because I love coaching. Like, it really does it for me. I get carried away, same in games, and I can't necessarily retrieve the highfalutin language that is in my brain that I want to say. So I'm only thinking about this because of your very intelligent question. This isn't a predefined thought, but as you've asked, the answer has dawned on me that it's probably a way of shortcutting my answers so that I can just reach for one calming word that I know I can retrieve at any given moment. And it has one word, has 1,000-word meaning to me and 1,000-word meaning to my players, all of which are the same words. Why do I choose those words? I think you're absolutely right. I don't know that I have said those things 1,000 times, but I have practiced those concepts 1,000 times with my players. And eventually you start to do any kind of analysis of your sessions or your session plans and curriculum. You start to see all these, or positional play, which is very important to me. You start to identify these key common either concepts or behaviors, and then you start to kind of attach nomenclature to them. So double movement, dismarking, circulation, probing, all these kinds of things that mean third, and there's some standard common ones like third man, fourth man, free man, all these kinds of things that mean stuff to other people as well, not just people inside inside your club, and that you start to cherry pick and whittle it all down and what fits you and what don't you use. And I think that's how you start to, or at least that's how I started to probably build up my football vocabulary.
I think the more you can engage with others, it just helps, right? You kind of said there, you cherry pick, you steal things from other people, or you tweak it. And we had a discussion briefly about a guy who I used to work with where he used a number system, and nobody else knew what he was using when he said 3, but all of his players understood what a 3 was, and they were all playing in the same way. And by the time the game's finished, and you're only playing once a year, but by the time the game's finished, you figured out what 3 meant, but he's already beaten you. So we'll get you next year, maybe. And I think that's where we can really get out with the language that players will move between teams. They will go and play up, or you've got younger players coming to play in your team. And if you build that environment where everybody's talking the same thing, and you read a lot of stuff online about the youth academies at Ajax and Barcelona and how they all play the same way, they have the same philosophies, they have the same styles and instructions. So it's easy enough for a player to go and play in another position in another team because the style of play is the same. And that is severely lacking in a lot of clubs in the US, has been my experience.
I think your experience is 100% right, because it's my experience as well. And I think sometimes inadvertently there might be shared elements of play, but Coach X and Coach Y don't know that because there's no common frame of reference. There's no sit-down meetings and discussions or coaching education. It's just, whatever you do, whatever this coach does, he does. But talk about the language. I mean, I remember growing up, I think what you would now call third and fourth man movements were often referred to as turn it round the corner, and then and then for the fourth man pass, they'd go and another one or something, or it means the same thing. But so I think that is important for US coaches, maybe even more than anywhere else, because the culture is so young. I think it's a great culture. I think it's going to develop to be an even better culture, but you need to get yourselves on the same hymn sheet first before you start diversifying. You need to identify commonalities that you can all work from and all help each other with to improve the overall game and overall coaching, and then start to spread up. And there's no point in, John from high school coach John from Mississippi, who's 70, just deciding he's going to now follow Tuchel and be a Tuchel disciple without knowing the rest of the game and the rest of the nuance and the sharing common language and common points with another coach, because he can't discuss it. How do you improve? You're only going to improve by trial and error only, and you're only coaching 3 times a week, and you're only playing once at the weekend. I mean, that's a big part of it, but discussion, Twitter, YouTube, watching games, video analysis, coaching courses, coaching education. I can honestly tell you that some of the best learning experiences were on these NSCAA courses where they gave you no homework in the evening, all right? So you were free to just hang out with your roommates and your classmates and talk. And people would be putting up YouTube clips of their teams and showing you little analysis they'd done and sharing information. I didn't have too much to share. I was just listening to it. This is brilliant, So I think that's very important. I think you bring up a very good point.
It just I know you have a book out. Plug for it, and where can people get it?
Oh, good man. It's available on Amazon. I self-published through them. It was a real labor of love, word for word, what I currently use at CUSA for our game model, and then the session plans and the curriculum that allow you to go and coach that game model. So for me, like you say, we're friends on Twitter. You probably see that big part of my agenda is to stop coaches wasting their hard-earned money on the nonsense. Now, you might say, well, who are you to judge that? And you'd be absolutely right. But what I can do is give you my honest to goodness, finance-free opinion. The books that we publish, and most people will tell you this, are not making us any money, all right? All they're doing is helping probably cover the costs and spread the word.
Part of the value, too, it's something that you're using. It's not something that you've just created and just pushed out there and said, well, yeah, hopefully I'll get some money from it. But it's really something that you genuinely use, and you're working within that framework. You know what it is. It means something to you, and I truly value Twitter for the ability to, as we said earlier, throw 140 characters out there, or 280 or whatever it is now, and throw it out there and throw an idea out, or throw a quick animation of a session plan and gather feedback, or just give it some legs and give it some air. But then there's also a place for the place that you work really hard and the material that you work really hard on. There's definitely a value in that. And I have some material that I have too, and that comes from experience of working with different teams and different environments and answering the same question over and over. And it's nice to have that as an option of revenue for ourselves, but also a place that we can kind of establish ourselves and say, I will put my name on this because I believe that strongly in it.
Yeah, and it's opened a lot of doors for me, and it started some really good conversations, which have then fed into my learning. I'm currently doing an analysis course. They call it scouting and analysis, but it's more scouting in terms of not scouting opposition for the next game. It's sort of analysing how teams play in general. Almost punditry in a way, but I could never go and get their expertise if I had to do it on my own, or I could, but it would take me 20 years, and I straight up believe that. Whereas I've gone in, I'm 40, I realise I haven't got all the time. I'm not old, but I'm not young. I do need to shortcut some of this learning, and if a topic sings to me or appeals to me, well, then I go and invest more time in it. But this course has opened my eyes in terms of analysis so much that I already know it's improved me as a coach. I already know it's given me a few other areas. It's like, you know when you get those spam windows come up on your computer and you click one to close it and then 5 more open up? Well, this course has done that for me, and it's given me about 5 other areas that I now know I have to get better in to be a better coach. But I don't think I'd have got to those 5 if I hadn't seen the one course, and hopefully that this book will help people with that.
Brilliant. So on Amazon, get on there, people. Go get it. Go get your hands on it. Go and click on that browser that opens up 5 more, because your players will thank you in the long run. So you're very active on Twitter, Paddy. What's your Twitter handle?
At King8Paddy.
So we'll definitely push people to that. And then one last question for you, mate, before we wrap up. When you leave CUSA, how can you say that your job's been done? How do you know that you've gone and implemented whatever you saw as a great opportunity? What can you say that you've implemented? What can you say that you've done and walk away with a head held high?
I think you actually touched on this earlier inadvertently, and for me, what I would say signals my job being done there is when I don't have to give coaches session plans, game models, curriculum, syllabus. It's become so ingrained and embodied by everyone at the club that it almost perpetuates itself a little bit like, you might say, I don't mean to draw grand conclusions or comparisons rather, but at Barcelona, right, unequivocally, that club has a DNA that runs through it, and it could go through 5 changes of head coach and president and board, and still the same stuff runs through it. It's very visible. You can touch Barcelona's behaviour, their characteristics, their DNA. I would like that to be my inverted commas legacy.
So as I wrap up this episode with Paddy, I'm really interested to know your feedback and what you've taken away from this, because for me, it really was like clicking that window that then opens 5 more. It just makes you curious enough to perform a couple Google searches and look a little bit more into things like the positional play or like the dismarking that we talked about, and you'll find a hashtag for it even on Twitter. But definitely get involved on Twitter, follow Paddy, so at King8Paddy, and then also myself at Lee Dunn Soccer. You can follow up more on leedunsoccer.com and look out for more material coming very soon. Finish with a final thank you to Paddy and for his time. We actually ended up talking for over 2 hours, and it was so difficult to get all of that across into something that's quite manageable to listen to. But again, thank you, Paddy. Thank you to Tactical Pad, and thank you to you for listening. I really appreciate your feedback and sharing this with any other coaches or soccer parents that are out there. And of course, there'll be more coming in a couple of weeks.